So previously on Planning Phase Syndicate, we had a series called Chess Wing, where we discussed the different maneuvers, the different list building aspects, zero churn, obstacle placement, maneuvering, attacking, engagement, and everything you want to know about X-Wing and comparing it to chess. The reason we did this was there's a couple reasons. One, because I feel chess is one of the longest standing games that has some of the most theory strategy stuff written about it. And it does not change its points value. It does not change how the pieces maneuver. It doesn't change any of that. And somehow people are still writing large volumes of theory on this specific game. And so what I wanted to do is I wanted to kind of take it through this series like we have and compare it and talk about, how is chess like X-Wing, right? And how can we understand X-Wing differently? So to begin with, we went through, opening phase, we went through obstacle placement, turn zero, all of these other things. And we're finally past middle game and onto the end game. So chess end game, the definition is a little bit muddied. A lot of people want to argue about it. This is kind of where we have come to the conclusion here. Is the end game in chess is a phase of the game that occurs after most of your pieces have been exchanged, right? There is no strict criteria technically for end game because a lot of experts will actually disagree with each other on what it is. What I took from it, and essentially how I saw it, was these 4 main points. Kings get to become active and are more aggressive. Pawns are passed and ready for promotion, which we'll get to what that means in a minute. Mm-hmm. I'm going to butcher this word, but it's Zugzwang, which is German. Or essentially what it means is when a player is obligated to make a move, any move that will worsen their position, and 4 or fewer pieces on the board other than your pawns and your king. Now, endgame has 5 generalizations that people talk about. In the king and pawn endings, an extra pawn is technically more decisive in 90% of the cases. So if you are up a pawn, which means you're technically up in points, which we talked about before, you have a 90% chance of winning, which is crazy to me. That's huge, right?
Yeah, and when you look at that, in the X-Wing frame, having that extra ship and towards the end of the game, where you're looking at like the final 20 or even 10 minutes of the game, just having that extra piece, being able to if it's a lower initiative ship going in, being able to block the action of an enemy ship, or getting in the path from either getting another scenario action or getting off an extra piece of ordnance. Having that extra pawn as that blocker is a huge deal, especially if you're trying to protect points either on your ship that has like a salvage crate, or protecting the objective that's there by not allowing your opponent to grab it. It's absolutely right. Having that extra pawn alive in those cases helps you keep your points, or prevent your opponent from having those points towards their favor. So yeah, that makes sense.
Yep. Another generalization is end games with pieces and pawns. An extra pawn has the winning advantage. A winning advantage, right? And it becomes more decisive if the stronger side has a positional advantage as well. The king plays an important role in endgame, which you don't typically see in chess. Usually you want to protect your king, protect it. Initiative is more important in the endgame than in other phases of the game. In rook endgames, the initiative is usually worth at least a pawn. That's pretty big too. 2 connected passed pawns are very strong. If they reach their 6th rank, they are generally as powerful as a rook. And that's essentially when we talk about passed pawns, essentially what passed pawns means is when your pawn moves over your competition, right, towards that edge of the board, because then you can promote it to be whatever you want it to be. most people pick a queen because that's the smart thing. But if you get 2 of them, your opponent now has to have 2 pieces they have to go after. And that, when we talk about X-Wing in game in a few minutes here, that will be extremely important. Now, there is 2 divisions of endgame, with pawns and without pawns. And for in my opinion, for the X-Wing, it's really not super important. And that's because we're not going to actually delve out I don't know, there was like 15 actual endgame strategies that I had found. We're not going to go into each of those and show you the positions of them and blah, blah, blah. If you want that, you can look that up. But I think it's important to note the major difference. You could break essentially endgame up into 2 different divisions. And when we talk about X-Wing, right, we can have 2 different divisions we would break our ships up to. One would be having a lot of healthy ships, right? So that would be division 1, having a lot of healthy ships on the board. Division 2 would be having the ship advantage with lower health ships, whether they don't actually have health or because you've almost murdered all of them. Now, we're going to go through the 5 or the 6 strategies that they have, and then we're going to talk about how we can relate it to X-Wing. So the first strategy that they have is get a queen with your passed pawn. That simply means as your pawn goes over top of the competition and goes to the edge board, you want to get it promoted to a queen. Very simple. Everybody wants to do that. In X-Wing, we can't promote. we can't bring ships back from the dead, except for one ship, right? And what's that one ship, JJ?
Moralo? No. It's, oh my gosh.
Tell.
It's a scum one.
Yeah.
Yeah, I forgot.
Tell
yeah, I
think
it is Moralo.
Is it Moralo or is it Tell?
Yeah. Oh, yeah, you're right. Sorry. Tell Trevura. Yeah, okay. You're right. Tell.
So there you go. So that doesn't technically exist, but being able to understand the promotion of it is kind of where they're going with that.
I would kind of disagree a little bit. I do think that this particular strategy does exist in X-Wing, and it's very situational, right? When you take a look at some of the, like when we're going back and kind of classifying some of the pilots as kings or queens or rooks or aces, if you're in a list, let's say that's all initiative 4s, and you're facing off against a list that has an initiative 6 pilot and a bunch of initiative 3s, killing that initiative 6 pilot on your opponent's list now makes your other ships have a lot more value, because you're being able to move after your opponent and take shots before your opponent, and that all of a sudden makes your ships more valuable in that case. So it's essentially promoting your ships by taking out your opponent's queen in that case, and I think that's how that translates in X-Wing.
All right, cool. The next strategy, right, in chess is create a passed pawn. So if you don't have a pawn past it, how do you get your pawn passed, right? You know, so that could be having 2 pawns, sacrificing the one to let the other one go. It could be a whole bunch of different things, but the idea is to create a passed pawn. Another one is to win pawns either through attacking them or entering your opponent's camp, which is very much like Nina or Vader, being able to take actions and get behind other ships. Or what's that new interceptor, that new Sigma interceptor that can essentially do the 3 bank and then do a 3 sloop or something like that?
Sigma
like so crazy.
5, I want to say. Yeah, I think it's Sigma 5 that can do that. The slam action. Yeah, it's so nasty.
Yeah. So there's that, right? So getting into your opponent's camp, attacking their weakest flank. Those are our strategies for that. The next one is activating your king. And they talk about in chess strategy either moving your king towards the weakened pawns so that you can start picking off your opponent's pawns, or if there's no weak pawns, moving your king towards the center of the board so it cannot get trapped in a corner, which is what happens to me all the time because I'm stupid and don't move my king. That's what that happens to me way too often. Activate your natties. Yeah, there you go. Create weak pawns either by taking them, exchanging them, or exchanging other pieces, leading to stopping pawns from being able to pass. You can also provoke your opponent to move inopportunely. That happens in X-Wing all the time. I will tell you that. Like, people talk all the time. That's the one qualm I have with some of it, and like, I like an honest player that doesn't actually want to mess with you. And I like, for example, Sherman was very, when we did our game, it was, we were discussing, is Grievous gonna fit if he barrel rolls there? He goes, nah, I don't think it's going to, don't do it. And I did it anyway, and it didn't work. It didn't matter. So he was right. He didn't even try to play me. He was just telling me, he was just being honest. So
yeah.
Anyway, so that's the kind of play I like. But anyway, you can work to provoke your opponent, you know, into an opportunity. And then the last one that they talk about, right, is attack the king directly, right? So that's the most obvious one. Go get your king, go get their other king and corner them into a checkmate, right? I think everybody knows that one. That's, I don't to me, that doesn't even feel like strategy at this point. So now we got to talk about, how do we relate that to X-Wing, right? Because when we talk about X-Wing strategy during the end game, we got to kind of define, when does end game start, right? So JJ, I threw a few things on there. You can ignore those, but to you, when do you feel end game starts?
Well, in X-Wing 2.5, the end game typically starts when one or both players reach that 12 to 14 point range on the score for a particular game. At that point, you're typically within a ship and a half away from being able to reach your 20 points, especially when you start factoring the points from objectives. That's when the end game, in my opinion, begins for X-Wing, because that's where you have the greatest opportunity to end the game quicker. At that point, the game accelerates faster at that point. You typically have lesser ships at that point, so you're taking lesser turns. So the decisions become that much more crucial to try to win the game with whatever you have left on the board, and as well as attacking the objectives.
Yeah. Another one I would say too is looking at your clock, right? Like, so for example, pace of play is a thing. I get yelled at all the time about my pace of play sometimes. I take a little bit longer to make decisions, especially online, compared to um in person. In person, it's just so much easier to make decisions, I think. But anyway, so when you think about, like, if you are at 15 minutes left in your game, or you feel that you've had 5 churns, 4 to 5 churns, you're pretty sure you're in your in-game at this point. You know, very few players get, except for Crispy, I guess, and Nick, get into 11 round games. You don't see that very often. So I feel once you get down towards the end, it becomes kind of like a crunch time, right? The other piece of that, like you had said, was the 8 points. I feel if you, or the 12 to 14 points, I feel if you're scoring 8 objective points and then you have some set of ship points along with it, you are probably getting into that end game right there. Another one that I came up with was if you don't have a double score over your opponent, and healthy ships, you're probably in the end game. That seems pretty. Even if you're only at 10 points and they're at 5, but you have all healthy ships and they do not, yeah, I would say your end game, the end game is upon you. Also a strong command of objectives. Or the last is, if your ships are down to their last hull, essentially are close to their last hull, and you have 1 or 2 ships left. Those are kind of the principles for me that kind of trigger and say, hey, this is when in-game happens.
Yeah, I would definitely agree there. I mean, obviously, it does depend on the list. I mean, when you look at the double fire spray list, that's pretty much, you lose one of your fire sprays and yeah, you're automatically in the end game. But a lot of times too is the number of hull that you have left on your ships, right? Because you can have a situation where, let's say, you're running just like a vulture swarm and you have like a handful of them that just have 1 hull left. I would say that's pretty much the time for the end game as well, because you can easily lose a lot of vultures very easily, and that can end the game really fast.
All right. So now let's actually talk about strategy. So I purposely only put a few down. I did this on purpose because I don't want to overtalk JJ, and I feel that it would be better if we actually kind of went back and forth and said, here's a couple of different strategy points that we see. So what I'm going to do is give JJ the first crack at it and say, JJ, for you, what is one of the big in-game strategies that you have?
Well, one of the first things that took me a long time to really master, especially when I started getting to competitive X-wing, as a newer player, is identifying that you're actually in the end game. Right, a lot of players just kind of get lost in the quagmire of the game without realizing the positioning that they're in. Right, some players are just focusing on where they're putting their dials. They're focusing on like what their opponent has and stuff, and they don't actually take a step back essentially and look at the bigger picture. Right? Are they up in points? Are they close to any objectives? How much hull is left or life is left on your opponent's side that can swing the game in your favor? Or how many points do you have left to reach your goal? Right? And having that awareness mid game is something that is a very key skill to have, right? Sometimes you could get emotionally involved either through like a bad die roll that can happen, and that can essentially shake you up to the point that you lose focus of the greater picture of the game, right? So I think before you get to any other strategies, just having that awareness of, hey, am I in a situation where I can end this game within the next turn or two with the ships and the positions that I have, and what do I do to work to make that particular scenario happen so that way I can close the game. And it also works the other way, right? Does my opponent currently right now have a reachable goal where they can end the game within the next turn or two? And what can I do to delay that scenario from happening so that way I can buy myself more time to win the game for myself? And I think that's probably the most critical piece for a newer player when considering this part of when the end game starts.
Yep. A great example, my game against Sherman, I have a one haul Ketsu, and she's just flying away with one haul, and here Django claims an objective point versus a target lock. And of course, then Django rolls 2 blanks and an eyeball and gets 1 crit out of it, you know? That created a dice scenario where everything was about the dice, and then the variability of that was too high. There's a reason you run Django, and it's not for wanting to keep your dice variability. You don't run Django for that. You run it because you want it to be consistent, and I forgot consistency and hedged my bets on a range 0 shot into a buzz droid. So
yeah, exactly.
The one of the ones that I had was command more objective points than your opponent. So an in-game strategy is once you get towards that end game and you are close to being, so you're down to your last, let's just say 3 churns or 2 churns, can you command more objectives and not lose your ships? Like, that's the big piece for me, right? Because I think objective play now creates that difference. So if going into it you're down, 5 points, do you want to take every objective, or do you have to kill the ships? Well, what if you take 3 objectives and kill 1 ship? You win. Yeah. So understanding and being able to, and it's kind of like an ace play if we think about it, right? Ace play was very, very, very big for a long time, and it's because you had to learn when do you disengage. To points fortress. I hate saying that word, but that's to some extent what it is. Like when do you run away with Soontir versus engage with Soontir. In 2.5 meta, we are seeing a shift in that because, again, and again, it goes back to if you cannot wipe this other ship off the board to get ship points, you have to go after objective points. You have to. And identifying that in your mid game and then follow through with it in your end game is huge. And again, another point to, Sherman is when I ignored Q9 decided to 4K or whatever 5K or whatever they do, and come back around and pick up that objective point for 2 extra points in the last of the game, right? Huge. That's huge. That's a missed opportunity on my behalf, not acing that or getting rid of that ship and allowing that ship to go take objective points. And the more I talk about this, the more I really decided I definitely should not have won that game.
Yeah.
But understanding objectives and when to take them versus attacking is huge in in-game.
Yeah, and of course this varies a lot, depending on the scenario. But you're absolutely right. Right, commanding more objective points put the pressure on your opponent to react to that state versus setting up the scenario for them to win. Right, because if you control more objective points, then that puts your opponent behind the 8 ball to try to move their ships in probably an unfortunate position or a less favorable position than yourself in order for them to contest those objectives and try to keep pace with you if you're ahead of points. Conversely, the other way around, if your opponent has control of the majority of your objective points, now you're rushing to try to collect those or at least stop your opponent from collecting those points, and that could that could really spread out your formation or put them in a position where they can't really continue pursuit against the opponents to try to take out their ships, or they're left tokenless and leaving them up to possibly be destroyed by your opponent's ships just because you're trying to grab that objective. So yeah, definitely that's a very important point. Yeah.
All right. What would be another strategy piece for you, JJ?
Maintaining the lead, right? There are definitely times where you're ahead on points by a good margin, and all of a sudden your opponent just comes out and you have no idea how it happened. I've seen it's times where people are up by 12 points, and all of a sudden the opponent just comes in and just steals the win away. Recognizing your end goal at that point and keeping not losing your focus on maintaining that lead is definitely a very big skill to have. I've seen, particularly with like salvage mission, right? There'll be cases where somebody has a cargo and they'll have one hole, and sometimes they turn in to try to engage and try to get a shot, and they end up losing that ship and losing the salvage. If you look at one of the most basic ships, let's say an academy pilot, which is 2 points and has a cargo crate, that academy pilot does more work by staying out of the fight and keeping that salvage token away from the fight than grabbing a cargo token and then going in to try and engage. You potentially give your opponent 2 points, especially if it has no mods, and you also lose the potential of scoring that one objective point for carrying that crate, because you're trying to force the situation into your favor. Sometimes it does pay off, but most of the time it's usually not worth to try to overcommit your forces when you can better utilize them by securing that objective and not trying to kill your opponent in that case.
Another one that I felt was extremely important is create poor choices for your opponent. And one of the options I had was by creating bumping opportunities. So there's that, right? That doesn't have to be the only poor choice that they can make, but giving them poor choices. Do you, and again, think about it this way: if you have like a full health Django at the end of, turn 4, your opponent has to make a conscious decision. Are you going to focus your efforts on burning Django down, or are you going to ignore Django and just go hams in on another win condition, right? So then understanding that and creating bump opportunities, in my opinion, bumping can be extremely bad because they still get a bloody focus and range 0 shots are still a thing, which I hate. But creating that opportunity for you to be able to take and stop that ship from its optimal position. And we talked about it in opening maneuvers and mid game is controlling spacing on the board. And they don't talk a lot about that in end-game chess theory, but to me, controlling that space is huge, especially if you know your opponent's win condition is getting that extra objective or two, and you stop them with a bump, they can no longer take that objective. Then it becomes a dice game, and then I guess if you get outdiced, you get outdiced, and it is what it is, right? That's not a thing that we can change, right? But it is creating and taking the variability piece out of it as much as you can.
Yeah. And then lastly, one of the other strategies is recognizing the value of ships versus objective points. There are times where in the end game piece, you'll have an opponent who has a big ship that is down to its final 2 or 3 hull, where it's in danger of dying, and you have the opportunity to pick up, let's say, a salvage crate or assault a particular location to maintain those objective points. Sometimes it's worth just ignoring that objective just to secure those points in your favor, if you're able to guarantee that point, right? Especially if you're, like, let's say, facing down a decimator that has no agility and only 3 hull left, it's probably better to try to focus down and kill that ship, if it can guarantee you to either put you ahead in points, or even possibly win the game, versus trying to chase down a salvage crate, which can only possibly give you one point, if it's like not claimed. So just recognizing those situations where you're trying to identify what's going to give you the most gain in objective or in points in general, and trying to pursue that without compromising your position.
Yep. Another one I just thought of was understanding your dice variability and how it will play into getting you to your end game goal. So if your end game goal and you're in a very close race, do you take the opportunity to worry about dice variance? And I'll say again why I hate range 0. But if you're taking a range 0 shot with 3 red dice versus 1 or 2 green dice, you have to understand what is your probability that you're going to get the hits and crits that you need. What is that probability? And I think that's the big piece of it. There is understanding that, and again, that would be the same thing as if you're facing down a Grievous who has, almost full health. Do you re-roll your crits? Yes. If you can re-roll them, you re-roll your crits because because a blank is better than especially in end game. There you go. Not at the beginning of the game, but in end game, re-rolling that crit to either a hit or a blank or an eyeball is a million times better than allowing him to go, is it a ship crit? Because what is our ship crit probability inside of your damage stack? And because we don't get to look at all the damage cards, we have no idea what ship crits are underneath there versus regular crits. So you had to treat it a little bit kind of like counting cards in blackjack, right? Like, all right, the probability is I've gone through 80% of the ship crits. I have 20% of the deck left. Like 30% of those are going to be ship. 70% of them are going to be pilot or whatever the other one is, right? And that's a huge thing, because if you have the opportunity to take the shot with the dice and you have a higher probability, again, if I roll 3 red dice on 1 green dice, what's the probability I get that last 1 hit point or 2 hit points that I need? So understanding what your variability is in your dice is huge, because it can help you make decisions as you move into your end game.
Yep, exactly.
Any other ones, JJ? Any other things that you think we might have missed for in-game strategy?
The last thing I'll say is more of a mental thing. It's easier for some players. It's harder than others. But no matter what, keep your cool in the game. It's easy to feel overconfidence whenever dice are going your way, or it's easy to feel defeated, or down whenever, like, dice blank out on you early on at the beginning and you lose a ship. Don't give up. there's been so many times personally where I felt like my initial engagement just totally favored my opponent, and I lost a key piece of my list, and I just managed to somehow crawl back because I stayed in the game, and I didn't let that bad engagement determine the rest of my game. Like I kept at it. I still had other ships on the board, and I just adjusted my strategy to keep on, and you never know what happens, right? Dice are dice. Sometimes they skew very much in your favor in engagements, and sometimes they skew in your opponent's favor. At the end of the day, it's up to you to give yourself the best chance possible with the pieces that you have to win the game.
Yep, and I think that's fair. And I will say that is probably the hardest piece I have. That I struggle with is because if I feel I'm losing too much or that I can't see that end win condition, I become defeated, right? And then I feel, oh my god, I'm not going to win this. Um, and again, another example would be is, if like you say, if you lose that important piece, if I lose Django in 3 rounds, can the rest of my list make up for Django, or is it just an automatic loss? And my game versus Sandy a couple weeks ago, perfect example. I lost Django right away, but in the end, it came down to literally the last shot of the game, even with losing Django. And so, if I had completely just given up on life, that game would have easily been, I would have made more mistakes, and that game easily would have been handled. But as long as you keep in your head, hey, there still could be a win condition. There still could be this. And then it goes back to our discussion on list building, right? Like, if you're building a list with a king in it, you might be not playing X-Wing correctly. We have very few kings in X-Wing. Very, very few kings are ever in X-Wing.
Yes.
So, well, thank you, everyone. Thank you so much for being a part of this strategy talk.